A Shadowed Pages. Welcome to you all from Shadowed Pages. I'm Edward, your host for tonight, and I'm so glad you've joined me. Tell me, where are you tuning in from, and how's your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now let's begin the mystery. Rosewood Hall sat at the edge of the village like a relic that had refused to learn the modern world's manners. Its windows were tall and narrow, its brickwork darkened by decades of rain, and its gardens, though once formal, had softened into something almost secretive. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the drawing-room window with her knitting resting idle in her lap, observed the house with the same quiet attention she gave to people. Buildings, she believed, could be just as revealing as their occupants. The invitation had arrived 2 days earlier, written in a firm, angular hand. Colonel Arthur Whitcomb, recently retired and newly installed as the owner of Rosewood Hall, had requested her presence for tea. The reason, hinted at but not explained, suggested a small domestic difficulty. Miss Marple had seen enough of those to know they were rarely small at all. Tea had just been poured when the first disturbance occurred. The clock on the mantel chimed 4 with a solemn insistence, and almost at once a sharp sound echoed from the upper floor. It was not loud, but it was decisive, like a door closing with purpose rather than care. Colonel Whitcomb paused, cup halfway to his lips, his brows knitting together. "That will be my sister," he said after a moment. "Agnes keeps peculiar hours." Miss Marple smiled politely but said nothing. She had already noticed that Agnes Whitcomb had not joined them, despite being mentioned earlier as devoted to punctuality. Before she could reflect further, a maid entered the room, her expression tight and uncertain. "Beg pardon, sir," the girl said, "but Miss Agnes isn't answering. I knocked and there was no reply." Colonel Whitcomb set his cup down with a faint clink. "Nonsense. She must have fallen asleep again. I'll go myself." They went upstairs together, the colonel striding ahead with growing irritation, Miss Marple following at a measured pace. The corridor was narrow, lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to watch their progress. Agnes Whitcomb's room lay at the end, its oak door shut firmly. Colonel Whitcomb rapped sharply. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It did not move. "She locks herself in sometimes," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Agnes, open the door at once." Silence pressed back at them. The maid hovered behind, twisting her hands. Miss Marple leaned closer to the door, her eyes moving thoughtfully over the keyhole. "It is locked from the inside," she observed gently. The colonel frowned. "Yes, well, but the spare key?" Miss Marple asked. The maid shook her head quickly. "There isn't one, miss. Not since the last was lost." That detail settled into Miss Marple's mind like a stone dropped into water. Colonel Whitcomb ordered the door forced, and after a brief, awkward struggle, the lock gave way. The door swung inward. Agnes Whitcomb lay on the bed, her hands folded neatly over her chest. The window was shut, the curtains drawn back to admit the late afternoon light. There was no sign of disturbance, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. And yet, even to Miss Marple's untrained medical eye, the stillness of Agnes's body was unmistakable. She was quite dead. The doctor arrived within the hour, his examination brisk and subdued. "Heart failure," he said, though his tone suggested he would welcome a second opinion. Colonel Whitcomb accepted the verdict with visible strain, but Miss Marple noticed the way his gaze kept returning to the broken lock, as though it contradicted something he could not articulate. The local constable, a young man with earnest eyes, arrived shortly afterward. He listened carefully, asked the expected questions, and examined the room with the air of someone aware that appearances were rarely trustworthy. Miss Marple watched him with mild approval. "No sign of anyone entering or leaving," the constable said at last. "Door locked, windows shut. If Miss Agnes died of natural causes, it seemed straightforward enough. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. Straightforward things often aren't, you know. The constable turned to her, startled but polite. Do you think otherwise, miss? She gestured lightly toward the bedside table where a glass stood empty. Miss Agnes was devoted to her routines, was she not? Tea at 4, her brother said so, and yet she did not come down. She often took it in her room, Colonel Whitcomb said quickly. Of course, Miss Marple agreed. Still, it seems odd that she would lock the door so firmly and then drink her tea alone without ringing for the maid, especially on a day when she was expecting company. There was a pause. The constable frowned slightly, and the maid let out a small, involuntary gasp. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the hush. Locked rooms, she reflected, had a way of being far less secure than people imagined, and Rosewood Hall, for all its solid walls and heavy doors, already felt full of small, telling cracks. The news spread through Rosewood Hall with the peculiar speed of a whisper that grows louder as it travels. Servants gathered in doorways, then retreated, their faces pale and their voices subdued. Colonel Whitcomb dismissed them sharply, ordering the house closed to visitors and instructing the maid to bring tea to the smaller sitting room. It was there that Miss Marple found herself once more, seated near a window overlooking the overgrown rose garden, while the constable and the doctor conferred in low tones near the fireplace. Colonel Whitcomb stood apart, his back stiff, one hand resting on the mantel as though he needed the support. Grief, Miss Marple reflected, often looked remarkably like irritation in those unaccustomed to it. She watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in his fingers whenever the constable's voice rose. There's something else, the doctor said at last. I didn't mention it earlier, as I wanted to be certain. Miss Agnes had a faint smell of bitter almonds about her mouth. The constable straightened. Poison? It's possible, the doctor replied carefully. I cannot say without a proper examination, but it would explain the suddenness. Colonel Whitcomb turned sharply. Are you suggesting my sister was murdered? The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression one of mild concern rather than surprise. Locked rooms had a way of producing such words with unfortunate ease. It's too early to say, the constable answered, but if poison was involved, someone must have had access to her. Impossible, the colonel said. Agnes was difficult, yes, but hardly the sort to invite enemies. She lived quietly. She had no visitors. No visitors today, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. The constable turned to her again, curiosity now outweighing politeness. You've noticed something, haven't you, miss? Miss Marple inclined her head. Only small things. But small things have a habit of becoming important. For instance, Miss Agnes's tea. The maid, who had returned with the tray, froze. Her tea, miss? Yes, Miss Marple said kindly. You brought it up to her room at 4, did you not? The girl nodded. As usual. I knocked. She told me to come in. She was sitting by the window. I set the tray down and left. Did she lock the door then? Miss Marple asked. I didn't hear it, miss, but she often did after. Miss Marple smiled gently. And when you went back later? I didn't, the maid said, her voice trembling. I only went when she didn't come down. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking. A locked door, an empty glass, a routine followed just closely enough to seem ordinary. She had seen it before, though never in precisely the same arrangement. The constable cleared his throat. Was anyone else in the house this afternoon? Colonel Whitcomb hesitated, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. There was Mr. Lewis, he said at last. My secretary. He left shortly after 3. And where was Miss Agnes then? The constable asked. In her room, the colonel replied. She said she had a headache. Miss Marple looked up. Did she indeed? How very inconvenient. The colonel flushed. What do you mean by that? Oh, nothing unkind, Miss Marple said. Only that headaches are such useful explanations. One hears them often, particularly when someone wishes to be alone or wishes others to think they are. The constable made a note. I should like to speak with this Mr. Lewis. Of course, the colonel said stiffly, though I fail to see... Miss Marple's gaze drifted back toward the staircase, toward the room at the end of the corridor. May I see Miss Agnes's room again? She asked. There was a moment's pause. Then the constable nodded. I don't see why not. The room was exactly as before, neat, orderly, and faintly austere. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in details others overlooked. The teacup sat washed and dry on the tray now, but she could picture it as it had been, the faint ring at the bottom, the last swallow taken without hesitation. On the bedside table lay a small bottle of medicine, its label worn. She picked it up, turning it carefully. Did Miss Agnes take this regularly? Yes, the colonel said, for her heart. Miss Marple replaced it precisely where it had been. How fortunate, she said softly. A person with a weak heart is always so obliging when death comes unexpectedly. The constable frowned. You think the heart trouble was used to disguise something else? I think, Miss Marple replied, that disguises are rarely elaborate. They rely on what people are already prepared to believe. She walked to the door, examining the broken lock. This door was locked from the inside, yes. But locks can be fastened in more ways than one imagines. I once knew a girl in St. Mary Mead who... She stopped herself, smiling apologetically. Forgive me. Old habits. As they left the room, Miss Marple felt the house close around them again, its corridors thick with unspoken tensions. Someone in Rosewood Hall had relied on routine, on assumptions, and on a locked door to keep their secret. And already, that door was beginning to open. Evening settled over Rosewood Hall with a hush that felt imposed rather than natural, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Lamps were lit one by one, their soft glow revealing corners that daylight had been kind enough to overlook. Miss Marple sat once again in the smaller sitting room, her knitting abandoned now, her hands folded loosely as she listened to the muted sounds of the household resuming its careful movements. The constable returned from the telephone with a thoughtful expression. Mr. Lewis will come tomorrow morning, he said. He seemed surprised to hear of Miss Agnes's death. Shocked, even. So many people are, Miss Marple said mildly. Shock is a very flexible emotion. Colonel Whitcomb sank into a chair opposite her, suddenly looking older, the lines in his face drawn deeper by the lamplight. I don't understand any of this, he said. Agnes was difficult, yes, but she was my sister. She had no reason to... He stopped, his mouth tightening. No one had reason to harm her. Miss Marple regarded him with gentle seriousness. People rarely harm others for reasons that seem sufficient to outsiders. Often it is something very small, allowed to grow unchecked. The doctor had departed, but not before advising that an inquest would be necessary. That word lingered, casting its own particular shadow. The constable cleared his throat again, a habit Miss Marple was beginning to recognize as his way of bracing himself. There's something else, he said. The maid mentioned that Miss Agnes argued with someone yesterday. Colonel Whitcomb looked up sharply. Argued? With whom? She didn't know, the constable replied. She heard raised voices near the study. She assumed it was you. It was not, the colonel said firmly. I was in the village yesterday afternoon. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. How interesting. And the study is on the ground floor, is it not? Quite near the back stairs. Yes, the colonel said. Agnes occasionally used it. She said the light was better, and privacy more complete, Miss Marple added softly. They went to the study together, the constable carrying a lamp. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the air disturbed only recently. A desk stood near the window, its surface meticulously arranged. Miss Marple approached it, her gaze lingering on the blotter. "There has been writing here," she said. The constable leaned closer. "How can you tell?" "Indentations," Miss Marple replied. "One needn't see the words to know they were written with some force." Colonel Whitcomb shifted uneasily. Agnes was always writing letters. Complaints, mostly. "Were they ever posted?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "Not always." Miss Marple moved to the fireplace, where a small grate held the remains of ash. She stirred it gently with the poker. "Paper has been burned here recently." The constable nodded. "I noticed that earlier." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple said. "Letters, once burned, cannot defend themselves." She turned back toward the desk, opening a drawer that was not locked. Inside lay a thin notebook. She did not touch it, merely observed. "Miss Agnes kept records," she said. "Accounts, perhaps, or observations." Colonel Whitcomb's voice was strained. "Agnes had a tendency to interfere. She believed it was her duty." "Duty," Miss Marple repeated. "A very dangerous word." The constable closed the drawer gently. "We'll need to examine this properly." As they left the study, Miss Marple paused by the back stairs. "Someone could move quite easily through here without being noticed," she remarked, "especially in a house where habits are predictable." "Yes," the constable said slowly. "The maid said Miss Agnes dismissed her early yesterday evening." "Another small convenience," Miss Marple said. They returned to the sitting room, where silence pressed in again. "Coronel." Whitcomb poured himself a drink, his hand unsteady. "If you believe someone poisoned her," he said, "then the locked door was meant to reassure," Miss Marple finished. "Locked rooms create certainty where none exists." The constable looked thoughtful. "You mentioned earlier that locks can be fastened in more ways than one." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A piece of string, a well-placed pin, even something as simple as habit. If one expects a door to be locked, one rarely questions how." A clock chimed the hour, its sound echoing through the hall. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening of a pattern beginning to emerge, threads aligning with quiet insistence. Words spoken in anger, letters destroyed, routines altered just enough to allow a single, decisive act. She rose. "I think," she said gently, "that Miss Agnes knew something she should not have known, and someone believed that a locked door would be enough to keep that knowledge from leaving the room." The constable nodded slowly, his earlier certainty replaced by something sharper. Outside, the night deepened around Rosewood Hall, and within its walls, the careful balance of secrets had begun, at last, to shift. Morning arrived reluctantly at Rosewood Hall, pale light seeping through curtains that had known better days. The house stirred with a careful quiet, as though each occupant feared that too much sound might disturb whatever fragile order remained. Miss Marple slept lightly and rose early, her mind already busy with the small inconsistencies she had gathered like pins in a cushion. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard voices in the hall below. Colonel Whitcomb stood near the front door with the constable, their conversation subdued but intense. Miss Marple slowed her step, not from any desire to eavesdrop, but because haste so often caused one to miss what mattered. "This morning," the constable was saying, "he's agreed to come at once." "I don't see the point," the colonel replied sharply. "Lewis was devoted to his work. He respected my sister." "Respect," Miss Marple said gently as she reached the last step, "can be such a flexible sentiment." Both men turned. Colonel Whitcomb's expression flickered between irritation and reluctant relief. "Miss Marple, you slept well, I hope." "Very well, thank you," she replied, "though the house is rather talkative at night if one listens." The colonel did not respond to that, but the constable's mouth twitched faintly. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The maid, pale and red-eyed, moved quietly between the sideboard and the table. Miss Marple noticed her glance more than once toward the doorway, as though expecting someone else to enter. Habit again, she thought. Habit was grief's closest companion. When Mr. Lewis arrived, he did so with an air of professional composure that seemed almost too carefully arranged. He was a neat man in his 40s, with precise movements and eyes that measured a room before settling anywhere. He greeted Colonel Whitcomb with restrained sympathy and inclined his head politely to Miss Marple. "I was deeply sorry to hear of Miss Agnes's passing," he said. "She was formidable." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Formidable people often leave deeper impressions than kinder ones." Mr. Lewis smiled faintly. She took a keen interest in the Colonel's affairs. The constable invited him into the study. Miss Marple followed without comment, seating herself near the window as though merely seeking the light. Mr. Lewis answered the early questions smoothly. He had left shortly after 3, he said. Miss Agnes had not been present. He had no knowledge of her condition. "Did you see her at all yesterday?" the constable asked. Mr. Lewis hesitated just briefly. "I passed her in the corridor," he said. She seemed agitated. "In what way?" Miss Marple asked. He glanced at her, surprised. She was carrying papers. She said she wished to speak with me later. "Did she?" Miss Marple said. "And did she say why?" "No," Mr. Lewis replied. "She rarely explained herself." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I've known such women. They prefer their power, implicit." The constable leaned forward. "The maid mentioned raised voices in the study yesterday." Mr. Lewis stiffened. "Miss Agnes and I disagreed about certain matters," he said carefully. "She accused me of mismanaging accounts." "And were you?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Mr. Lewis's smile was thin. "No." Silence followed that, heavy and unconvincing. Miss Marple watched his hands. They were clasped too tightly, the knuckles faintly pale. "She was quite insistent," he continued. "She said she had proof." "Proof," Miss Marple echoed. "Such a troublesome word." The constable made another note. "And after that?" "I left," Mr. Lewis said. "I thought it best." Miss Marple rose, crossing to the desk. "May I?" she asked, though she did not wait for permission. She opened the drawer and removed the notebook, holding it delicately. "This belonged to Miss Agnes, I believe." Mr. Lewis's gaze fixed on it. "Yes." "Would you care to tell us what is missing?" Miss Marple asked. The Colonel stared at her. "Missing?" "Pages," Miss Marple said. "The binding is strained. Something was removed." Mr. Lewis swallowed. Miss Agnes tore them out herself. "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said. "And then burned them in the grate, no doubt." The constable looked sharply at Mr. Lewis. "Did you see her do that?" "No," Mr. Lewis said. "But she was angry. She said she would not be ignored." Miss Marple closed the notebook. "Anger can make people careless," she said. "But it can also make others very afraid." Mr. Lewis stood abruptly. "Are you accusing me of something, madam?" "I am observing," Miss Marple replied. "There is a difference." The constable intervened gently. "You're not under arrest, Mr. Lewis, but I must ask you to remain available." Mr. Lewis nodded stiffly and left the room. Colonel Whitcomb sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "Agnes was convinced Lewis was stealing from me," he said quietly. "I dismissed it as spite." Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. Spite is often the shape truth takes when no one wishes to hear it. She moved toward the window, looking out at the rose garden, its blooms tangled and neglected. "Miss Agnes believed she was protecting something," she said. "And when she believed she had evidence, she thought herself safe." The constable frowned. "Safe?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Because she trusted in routine, in locked doors, in the idea that confrontation would wait for morning." She turned back to them, her eyes clear. "But someone knew exactly how much time they had." The house seemed to contract after Mr. Lewis's departure, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer in reaction to what had been said. Miss Marple felt it distinctly while she sat in the smaller sitting room, her knitting returned to her hands, more for comfort than necessity. The constable paced near the window, stopping now and then to look out at the drive, while Colonel Whitcomb remained silent in his chair, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the mantel. At length he spoke. If Agnes truly believed Lewis was stealing from me, why not come directly to me? Miss Marple did not look up at once. Because she had before, perhaps, and felt unheard, or because she wished to be certain first. Some people value proof more than peace. The constable nodded slowly. She might have intended to confront him again. Yes, Miss Marple said, but not immediately. She had her tea after all. That small detail lingered between them. Tea at 4, a habit followed even in agitation. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered it. I should like to speak with the maid again, she said. The girl came at once, summoned with visible reluctance. She stood by the door, hands clasped, eyes darting nervously from one face to another. You brought Miss Agnes her tea yesterday, Miss Marple said gently. Did anything strike you as unusual? The maid hesitated. She was quieter than usual, miss, and she asked me to leave the tray. Normally she'd say something sharp about the sugar. And did she prepare it herself afterward? Miss Marple asked. The maid shook her head. No, miss. I always pour it before I leave. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then the tea was unattended for a moment. Yes, miss. Just a moment. The constable straightened. Who else was upstairs at that time? The maid frowned, thinking. No one, sir. Mr. Lewis was downstairs, I think. Miss Agnes sent me away early. Miss Marple's gaze softened. And after you left? I went down the back stairs, the maid said. I didn't hear anything after that. Miss Marple thanked her and watched as she slipped away, her footsteps barely audible. The constable exhaled slowly. If poison was added to the tea, it could have been done then. Or earlier, Miss Marple said. Or later. Poison is patient. Colonel Whitcomb rose abruptly. Are you saying someone walked into my sister's room while she was alive? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that someone ensured she would not leave it. She set her knitting aside and stood. May I see the kitchen? The kitchen was cool and orderly, the surfaces scrubbed to a dull shine. Miss Marple moved with quiet assurance, her eyes noting jars, tins, and the arrangement of cups. She stopped before a small cupboard near the sink. Where is the sugar kept? She asked. The cook opened the cupboard at once. Inside stood a familiar bowl, its lid slightly askew. Miss Marple lifted it, peering inside. Has this been disturbed? She asked. The cook hesitated. I couldn't say, miss. Miss Marple replaced the lid carefully. Of course. She turned her attention to a small shelf where cleaning supplies were kept. One bottle, unlabeled, caught her eye. She did not touch it, merely observed. Was this here yesterday? She asked. Yes, miss, the cook said. Mr. Lewis brought it in himself last week. Said it was for polishing silver. Miss Marple nodded. How helpful of him. They returned to the hall where the constable was already waiting. What are you thinking? He asked. That Miss Agnes trusted the visible things, Miss Marple said. The locked door, the familiar cup, the comfort of routine. But she underestimated how easily something ordinary can be altered. Colonel Whitcomb's voice was hoarse. Agnes was careful. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But careful people often assume others are careless. She paused by the foot of the stairs, looking up toward the corridor above. There is something else, she said. Miss Agnes dismissed the maid early and locked herself in. That suggests she expected privacy, not danger. Then she didn't suspect she would be harmed, the constable said. No, Miss Marple replied. She believed she was in control. The constable frowned. And the lock was not protection, Miss Marple said softly. It was theater, meant to suggest impossibility. They stood in silence for a moment, the house breathing around them. Miss Marple felt the pattern tighten further, the shape of it becoming clearer now. Someone had been cornered, and in their haste, they had relied on the simplest deception of all, that people would stop thinking once the door was closed. The day wore on with a strained slowness, every sound in Rosewood Hall seeming amplified by the knowledge that the house now held a truth that refused to remain hidden. Miss Marple found herself seated once more near the window, watching the pale autumn light drift across the garden. The roses, untended for some time, leaned into one another as though conspiring, their petals bruised by neglect. It struck her as oddly appropriate. The constable returned from a brief inspection of the outbuildings, his expression thoughtful. "Nothing out of place," he said. "No sign of anyone coming or going by unusual means." "People rarely do," Miss Marple replied. "They prefer familiar paths. Less effort, you see." Colonel Whitcomb stood nearby. His earlier defensiveness softened into a weary resignation. "You keep speaking of habit," he said, as though it were more important than motive. Miss Marple turned to him kindly. "Habit is motive's greatest ally. It allows people to act without thinking too closely about what they're doing." She rose and crossed the room, stopping near a small writing table tucked against the wall. Upon it lay a stack of correspondence, neatly tied with ribbon. Miss Marple touched the top letter lightly. "Miss Agnes was thorough," she said. "She kept records, observed patterns, noted discrepancies. That sort of person rarely confronts without preparation." The constable nodded. "She told Mr. Lewis she had proof." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And that knowledge changes things. It turns a nuisance into a threat." Colonel Whitcomb's voice was low. "If Lewis believed she intended to expose him, then time became his enemy," Miss Marple finished, "and haste leads people to rely on what they know best." The constable frowned. "But how did he manage it without being seen? He left before 4. "Did he?" Miss Marple asked gently. The constable hesitated. "That's what he said. And we have only habit to support it," Miss Marple replied. "People expect secretaries to leave quietly and promptly. One does not often watch the door after such departures." She walked toward the stairs again, ascending slowly. The corridor above was silent, the air faintly cool. Miss Marple paused outside Miss Agnes's room, studying the door with renewed interest. The broken lock had been temporarily repaired, but the frame bore the marks of its earlier violence. "May I?" she asked the constable, who had followed her. He nodded, producing a small torch. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty, peering at the lower edge of the door and the floor beyond. "There," she said softly. The constable leaned closer. "A mark?" "A scrape," Miss Marple said. "Very faint. Something thin dragged along the floor." He straightened slowly. "A string?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Or wire?" "Passed under the door, looped around the handle. A simple trick. One pulls from the outside and the door locks itself. I once knew a boy who..." She smiled faintly. "But that is hardly relevant." They returned downstairs where Colonel Whitcomb waited anxiously. The constable explained what they had found, his tone measured. "A string," the colonel repeated. "But that would mean that the door was locked after Miss Agnes was already unconscious," Miss Marple said. "Or worse." Silence settled heavily. Colonel Whitcomb sank into a chair. "Agnes trusted Lewis," he said quietly. "She allowed him into her confidence, and he..." "Trust," Miss Marple said gently, "is another form of habit. We trust those who have always been there." The constable glanced toward the kitchen. "And the poison?" "Likely something readily available," Miss Marple said. "Introduced in a way that seemed harmless. Sugar, perhaps. Or the cup itself. Miss Agnes would not have noticed a slight bitterness. Colonel Whitcomb closed his eyes briefly. She drank her tea because it was 4 o'clock. Yes, Miss Marple replied, because the world still made sense at 4 o'clock. The constable exhaled slowly. We'll need to have the contents of the cup examined, and the bottle in the kitchen. Of course, Miss Marple said. Facts must have their say. She returned to her seat, feeling the familiar calm that came when the pieces began to settle. The locked room no longer seemed impenetrable, merely theatrical. A performance staged for those who preferred neat endings. Miss Marple looked up as the maid passed the doorway, her face pale but attentive. "You see," she said softly to the constable, "murderers often believe they must create something extraordinary, but the truth is far simpler." The constable met her gaze. "Routine." "And fear," Miss Marple added. "Fear of being exposed." Outside, a faint breeze stirred the roses, loosening a few tired petals that drifted to the ground. Inside Rosewood Hall, the illusion of impossibility had begun to crumble, leaving behind a trail of ordinary actions leading inexorably toward an extraordinary crime. The constable returned in the early afternoon with news that tightened the atmosphere of the house still further. The laboratory in the nearby town had confirmed the doctor's suspicions. Traces of poison had been found in what remained of the tea leaves from Miss Agnes's cup. It was a mild dose, carefully measured, enough to still the heart of someone already weakened, yet subtle enough to invite a convenient conclusion. Colonel Whitcomb received the information in silence. He stood by the window, staring out at the garden without seeing it, his shoulders rigid. Miss Marple watched him with quiet sympathy. Betrayal, she knew, was often more painful than loss. The bottle from the kitchen, the constable added, contained the same substance. Officially a cleaning agent, but misused. Quite dangerous. Miss Marple nodded. And Mr. Lewis brought it into the house himself. Yes, the constable said. Which means he knew where it was kept. Colonel Whitcomb turned abruptly. Then why wait? Why not confront him at once? Because, Miss Marple said gently, we must be very certain. Truth has a way of slipping when rushed. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Mr. Lewis arrived later that afternoon, summoned by the constable's message. He entered the sitting room with a composed expression that faltered only slightly when he saw Miss Marple present once again. "I understand there are further questions," he said. "Yes," the constable replied. "About the poison?" Mr. Lewis's brows knit together. "Poison. It was found in Miss Agnes's tea," the constable said, "and in the bottle you brought into the kitchen." Mr. Lewis laughed softly, though the sound rang hollow. "That's absurd. Anyone could have used it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Anyone who knew where it was, and who knew Miss Agnes's habits." Mr. Lewis's gaze flicked toward her, sharp now. "Are you suggesting I poisoned her?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that you underestimated her." The colonel stared at Mr. Lewis. "Agnes accused you of stealing from me." Mr. Lewis stiffened. "She was mistaken." "Was she?" Miss Marple asked. "She kept records. She confronted you, and then the pages vanished." Silence stretched. Mr. Lewis's composure began to crack, fine lines appearing around his mouth. "She was wrong," he said again, more sharply. "She interfered in matters she did not understand." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said. "She understood very well, enough to frighten you." The constable leaned forward. "We know how the door was locked. A string, simple, effective." Mr. Lewis's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "You can't prove I was there." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You returned after 3, quietly. You knew the maid had been dismissed. You added the poison while the tea sat unattended. You spoke with Miss Agnes, perhaps hoping to reason with her. When that failed, you relied on routine, on her weakened heart, on a locked door to do the rest." "That's a story," Mr. Lewis snapped. "Nothing more." Stories, Miss Marple said softly, are made from patterns, and yours is very clear. The Colonel's voice broke. You stole from me. Mr. Lewis looked at him then, truly looked, and something hardened in his expression. I took what I was owed, he said. Years of service, and she would have ruined everything. The constable rose. That's enough. Mr. Lewis sagged slightly, the fight draining out of him. I didn't mean to kill her, he said. I only meant to scare her. She drank the tea so calmly. She always did. Miss Marple felt a familiar sadness settle over her. Because it was 4 o'clock, she said, and 4 o'clock was safe. The constable placed a hand on Mr. Lewis's arm. You're under arrest. As he was led away, Rosewood Hall seemed to exhale at last. Colonel Whitcomb sank into a chair, covering his face. Miss Marple approached him quietly. Miss Agnes believed she was protecting you, she said, in her own way. He nodded, unable to speak. Miss Marple returned to the window, watching as the light faded gently from the garden. The roses stirred once more in the breeze, shedding their last petals without protest. The locked room had given up its secret, not through force or cleverness alone, but through the steady unraveling of habit, fear, and the small human errors that bind them together. With Mr. Lewis gone and the constable occupied with formalities, Rosewood Hall slipped into a quieter, heavier rhythm. The truth, once spoken aloud, had altered the air of the place. It no longer pressed with suspicion, but with the dull ache of consequences. Miss Marple remained in the sitting room, her knitting resumed once more, the gentle motion of her hands a small counterpoint to the stillness that followed revelation. Colonel Whitcomb did not leave his chair for some time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and oddly calm. I should have listened to her. Yes, Miss Marple said without reproach, but people rarely listen to what unsettles them. It is much easier to call it fussing. He nodded faintly. Agnes was difficult, but she was thorough. She saw things I preferred not to see. Miss Marple's needles paused. That is often the fate of such people. They become inconvenient long before they are proved right. The maid appeared quietly at the door, uncertain whether she ought to interrupt. Miss Marple smiled at her. You may come in, my dear. The girl stepped forward. The constable asked me to say there will be an inquest, she said. Tomorrow. Of course, Miss Marple replied. There usually is. After the maid left, Colonel Whitcomb rose and walked to the window, standing where his sister had so often stood herself. She trusted the lock, he said. She always insisted on it, said it made her feel secure. Miss Marple followed his gaze to the garden beyond. Locks are comforting, she said gently. They suggest certainty, but certainty is a dangerous illusion. The remainder of the afternoon passed with small necessary tasks. Papers were gathered, questions answered, arrangements made. Miss Marple offered quiet assistance where it was useful and refrained from it where it was not. She had learned long ago that grief had its own pace and resented interference. As evening approached, Colonel Whitcomb joined her once more. You should not trouble yourself to stay, he said. This has been more than anyone could expect. Miss Marple smiled. I'm quite comfortable here, and I think Rosewood Hall prefers company just now. He gave a faint, weary smile in return. Later, as the lamps were lit, Miss Marple found herself alone in the corridor, upstairs. She paused outside Miss Agnes's room, now closed and silent. The door had been repaired, the mark on the floor barely visible unless one knew to look. She stood there for a moment, reflecting on how easily such traces were overlooked once the drama had passed. Miss Agnes had believed she was safe because she had followed the rules, locked the door, kept to her routine, trusted in the predictability of others. It was a mistake Miss Marple had seen many times before. People mistook familiarity for safety and habit for protection. Downstairs, Colonel Whitcomb's footsteps echoed faintly. Life, persistent and unembarrassed, was already resuming its claims. At dinner, they spoke little of the day's events. Instead, Colonel Whitcomb asked Miss Marple about St. Mary Mead, about its shops and its people, as though anchoring himself to a world where things were smaller and therefore more manageable. Miss Marple obliged, describing familiar faces and minor scandals with gentle humor. When coffee was served, Colonel Whitcomb sighed. Agnes would have disapproved of this blend, he said. Too weak. Miss Marple smiled. She would have said so, I expect. He looked down at his cup. I shall miss her. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Even difficult people leave a space no one else quite fills. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she felt the peculiar satisfaction that came not from cleverness, but from order restored. The truth, once uncovered, had a way of settling things, even when it brought sorrow with it. Rosewood Hall was quieter now, its secrets fewer, its locked doors less convincing. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour with steady assurance. Miss Marple listened to it for a moment before turning out the light, confident that when morning came, it would arrive not with mystery, but with the plain, enduring work of living on. The day of the inquest dawned grey and restrained, as though the sky itself had chosen discretion. Rosewood Hall bore the atmosphere of a place awaiting judgment, its rooms orderly, its occupants subdued. Miss Marple descended the stairs early, finding Colonel Whitcomb already awake, seated at the dining table with a cup of untouched tea before him. You should eat something, she said gently. He shook his head. Agnes would have insisted on toast. Miss Marple smiled faintly and poured herself tea instead, accepting the quiet as it was. Silence, she knew, could be companionable when shared by those who understood its weight. The inquest was held in the village hall, a plain building that offered little comfort and less distraction. Villagers gathered in respectful clusters, curiosity tempered by familiarity. Miss Marple took her seat near the front, her expression composed, her attention sharp. Colonel Whitcomb sat beside her, his face drawn but resolute. The coroner spoke calmly, methodically. Evidence was presented without embellishment. The poison. The tea! The locked door explained at last without theatrical flourish. The doctor's testimony confirmed what Miss Marple already knew, but hearing it aloud lent the truth a finality that could not be softened. Mr. Lewis was brought in, pale and diminished. He listened as his actions were laid out in clear, unemotional terms. There was no drama in it, no sudden revelation, only the slow, inexorable assembling of facts that left no room for denial. When he was asked to speak, his voice was flat, almost relieved. I didn't plan to kill her, he said. I thought her heart would fail later. I thought there would be time. Time, Miss Marple reflected, was the one thing people always misjudged. The verdict was delivered without surprise. Unlawful killing. The words settled heavily in the room, less like a conclusion than an acknowledgement. Colonel Whitcomb closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, his expression set. Afterward, the villagers dispersed quietly, their whispers muted by proximity to grief. Miss Marple and the Colonel walked back to Rosewood Hall together, neither speaking until the gates came into view. It all seems so ordinary now, he said at last, as though it might have been avoided. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Most things are. They paused in the rose garden where a few late blooms clung stubbornly to their stems. Colonel Whitcomb looked around, his gaze lingering on familiar paths and corners. Agnes loved this garden, he said, though she rarely tended it herself. Observation was her strength, Miss Marple said. Not cultivation, he smiled sadly. She observed too much. Or others observed too little, Miss Marple countered. Later that afternoon, the constable came to say his goodbyes. I wanted to thank you, he said, addressing Miss Marple with sincere respect. "You noticed what the rest of us overlooked." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I simply paid attention to what people expect not to matter." As he left, Colonel Whitcomb turned to her. "Will you stay longer?" "I think not," Miss Marple said. "My garden will be wondering where I am." He nodded, understanding. "Rosewood Hall will feel emptier." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but emptiness has a way of teaching us what truly belonged there." That evening, she packed her small case, folding her things with care. Before retiring, she took one last walk through the house. It felt different now, not lighter exactly, but settled, as though the walls had accepted what had passed. She paused once more outside Miss Agnes's room. The door was shut, but no longer forbidding. Miss Marple touched the handle briefly, then turned away. Downstairs, the clock chimed again, steady and unremarkable. Time moved on, as it always did, indifferent to locks and intentions alike. And with it, the final traces of the locked room at Rosewood Hall began, quietly, to fade. Early sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Rosewood Hall on the morning Miss Marple was to leave, lending the house a softness it had not possessed since her arrival. The sharp edges of suspicion and fear had dulled, replaced by a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. When Miss Marple came downstairs with her small case in hand, Colonel Whitcomb was waiting in the hall, his coat already on, his posture composed with quiet resolve. "I wanted to see you off," he said. "It seems wrong to let you go without thanks." Miss Marple smiled warmly. Life has a way of insisting on departures, whether we feel ready or not. They stepped outside together. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and roses nearing the end of their season. The garden lay calm, its paths undisturbed, as though it too were pausing to mark a conclusion. Colonel Whitcomb stood beside her for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the upper windows. "I keep thinking of Agnes at 4 o'clock, he said. "Sitting with her tea, believing that everything was as it should be." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Routine can be very comforting. It tells us the world is predictable. And yet it wasn't," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But then it rarely is." They walked slowly toward the gate. Colonel Whitcomb stopped and turned to her. "You've given me more than answers," he said. "You've given me clarity. Painful, perhaps, but necessary." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Truth often is, but it leaves room for honest mourning, which is no small thing." The driver loaded her case, and Miss Marple took her seat. Before the door was closed, she looked back at Rosewood Hall, its windows reflecting the morning light. It no longer seemed secretive, merely old, with all the history that implied. As the car pulled away, Miss Marple reflected on Miss Agnes Whitcomb, a woman whose sharpness had been mistaken for malice, whose vigilance had been dismissed as meddling. She had trusted in order, in locks and ledgers, believing that careful observation could keep chaos at bay. It was a belief Miss Marple understood well, even if she knew its limitations. The village slipped past, familiar and unremarkable. Life continued with its small errands and quiet dramas, indifferent to the tragedies it occasionally housed. Miss Marple found comfort in that. The world, after all, was not changed by a single crime, only clarified. Back in St. Mary Mead, her garden awaited her attention, its borders in need of trimming, its roses requiring care. She would tend them as she always had, mindful of how easily neglect invited disorder. Gardening, like detection, rewarded patience and attention to detail. As the train carried her homeward, Miss Marple folded her hands and closed her eyes briefly. The locked room at Rosewood Hall had promised mystery and delivered something simpler and sadder. A story of habit, fear, and the quiet dangers of being ignored. The door, once thought impenetrable, had opened as all such doors eventually did. Not with force, but with understanding. Miss Marple arrived back in St. Mary Mead in the early afternoon, the familiar rhythm of the village greeting her like a well-worn shawl. The hedges were neatly trimmed, the postman nodded as he passed, and the little station seemed blissfully unconcerned with locked rooms or poisoned teacups. Yet as she walked home, she found that Rosewood Hall lingered in her thoughts, not as a place of crime, but as a lesson patiently restated. Her cottage welcomed her with its quiet order. She set her case aside, changed her shoes, and went at once into the garden. The roses required attention. Dead blooms needed cutting back so that new growth might come unimpeded. Miss Marple worked slowly, thoughtfully, her mind revisiting each small step that had led to the truth. Not the poison itself, nor the string beneath the door. Those were merely tools, but the assumptions that had allowed them to work. Later that afternoon, her friend Mrs. Bantry stopped by, curiosity barely concealed beneath polite concern. News, after all, traveled swiftly when it had the decency to wear tragedy. So it was murder, then, Mrs. Bantry said, settling herself with a cup of tea. A locked room, no less, just like one of those dreadful books. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, though I find real life rather less inventive. People repeat themselves far more than they realize. But how did you know? Mrs. Bantry pressed. Surely the door... The door was the least convincing part, Miss Marple replied. Locked rooms depend upon confidence. Once people believe something is impossible, they stop asking how it was done. She stirred her tea gently. Miss Agnes was a woman who relied on order. She believed that routines protected her. Tea at 4, doors locked, accounts neatly kept. And because she believed in those things, she assumed others did too. And the man? Mrs. Bantry asked. Mr. Lewis relied on a different habit, Miss Marple said. That people rarely look twice at what they see every day. A secretary leaving at a familiar hour. A bottle in the kitchen that belonged there because someone said it did. A maid dismissed early because she always was. Mrs. Bantry frowned. And the string? A simple solution, Miss Marple said, but only effective because no one expects simplicity. He did not need ingenuity. He needed only to know Miss Agnes would drink her tea without suspicion and that the locked door would do the rest. Mrs. Bantry shuddered slightly. Poor woman. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. She was not kind, perhaps, but she was careful. Unfortunately, careful people sometimes forget that others notice them very closely. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window as dusk settled over the village. The lamps came on, one by one, steady and reassuring. Somewhere nearby, a clock chimed the hour. She found herself thinking again of 4 o'clock at Rosewood Hall, the hour that had seemed so safe, so dependable. Miss Agnes had not died because she was careless. She had died because she believed that familiarity equaled safety, and because she underestimated how far fear might drive an ordinary man. Mr. Lewis had not been a monster. That was what made it all so tragically inevitable. He had been frightened, cornered by figures and facts, and convinced that one small alteration to routine would save him. Miss Marple knew that illusion well. People believed disasters announced themselves with noise and warning, when in truth they slipped quietly into the gaps left by assumption. A few days later, a letter arrived from Colonel Whitcomb. It was brief and plainly written. He thanked her once more and said he had begun sorting through his sister's papers properly at last. Some accounts would need correcting. Some habits would need breaking. He wrote that Rosewood Hall felt emptier, but also clearer, as though windows had been opened after a long winter. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her writing desk. Clarity, she thought, was often the true aftermath of crime, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a sober understanding of what had been allowed to happen. She returned to her knitting, the needles moving with practiced ease. Outside, the village carried on as it always had, people trusting in their routines, their doors, their cups of tea taken at the proper hour. Miss Marple did not begrudge them that comfort. Routine had its place. It gave shape to days and meaning to time, but she also knew its dangers. Somewhere, someday, another locked door would present itself, solid and convincing, asking to be believed. And when it did, Miss Marple would remember Rosewood Hall, the quiet certainty of 4 o'clock, and the truth that no door was ever as closed as it seemed, provided one was willing to look not at what was dramatic, but at what was expected. She set down her knitting at last and rose to close the curtains, the room warm and orderly behind her. The day had ended as it began, without spectacle, and that, she reflected, was the most fitting conclusion of all.